Actualization of great nature. This sacred substance arises in the presences of all beings without distinction of brain system and exterior coating, chiefly in order that by its means they might consciously or automatically fulfill that part of their being duty which consists in the continuation of their species. But in the presences of three-brained beings, it arises also in order that it might be consciously transformed in their common presences for coating their highest being bodies for their own being. Before the second Transapalnean perturbation there, which period of their planet the contemporary three-brained beings defined by the words, before the loss of the continent Atlantis, when various consequences of the properties of the organ Kundabuffer had already begun to be crystallized in their presences, a being impulse began to be formed in them which later became predominant. This impulse is now called pleasure, and in order to satisfy it, they had already begun to exist in a way unbecoming to three-centered beings, namely, most of them gradually began to remove this same sacred being substance from themselves, only for the satisfaction of the said impulse. Well then, my boy, owing to the fact that most of the three-brained beings of the planet Earth thereafter carried out the process of the removal from themselves of this sacred substance, which is constantly formed in them, not at certain periods normally established by great nature for beings in accordance with their organization, simply for the purpose of the continuation of their species, and also owing to the fact that most of them ceased to utilize this sacred substance consciously for coating their higher being bodies, the result was obtained that when they do not remove it from themselves by ways which had then already become mechanical, they naturally must experience a sensation called circliniamen, or as your favorites there would say, the state defined by the words out of sorts, which state is invariably accompanied by what is called mechanical suffering. Remind me at some opportune moment about the said periods fixed by nature for the normal process of the utilization of exioihari by beings of different brain systems for the purpose of the continuation of their species, and I shall explain it to you in detail. Well then, in consequence of the aforesaid, and because, just like us, they are also only Kezchapmartnian beings, and the normal removal from their presences of this sacred substance, which constantly and inevitably arises in them, can proceed exclusively only with the opposite sex, when they utilize it for the continuation of the species by means of the sacred process El Muarno, and also because they were not in the habit of utilizing it for the purpose of coating their higher being bodies. These chance surviving three-brained beings there, namely those who had already been existing, as it is not becoming for three-brained beings to exist. That is to say, when during several of their years they had existed without beings of the opposite sex, began to turn to various anti-natural means for the removal from themselves of the sacred substance, exioihari, formed in them. The beings of the male sex then turned to the anti-natural means called mordorten and anthroparasti, or as the contemporary beings would say, onanism and pederasty. And these anti-natural means fully satisfied them. But for the three-brained beings of the passive sex, or as they are called, women, the said anti-natural methods proved to be not sufficiently satisfying. And so the poor woman orphans of that time, being already then more cunning and inventive than the men there, began to seek out and accustom beings of other forms of the given place to be their partners. Well then, it was after these partnerships that those kinds of beings also began to appear in our great universe, who in themselves are As our dear Mullah Nazarudeen would say, neither one thing nor the other. Concerning the possibility of this abnormal blending of two different kinds of Exioiharis, for the conception and arising of a new planetary body of a being, it is necessary to explain to you also the following. On the planet Earth, just as on other planets of our universe where Keschapmartnian three-brained beings breed and exist, that is to say, those three-brained beings, the formation of whose Exioihari for the purpose of creating a new being must obligatorily proceed in the presences of two distinct independent sexes. The fundamental difference between the sacred Exioiharis formed in the presences of the distinct and opposite sexes of Keschapmartnian beings, that is to say, in men and women, is that in the Exioihari formed in the presences of beings of the male sex, the localized sacred affirming or positive force of the sacred Triyamazikamno participates, while for the complete formation of the Exioihari in the presences of beings of the female sex, there participates the localized sacred denying or negative force of the same sacred law. And owing to the same all-gracious foresight and command of our Father of everything existing in the great universe, and according to the actualizations of Great Mother Nature, then in certain surrounding conditions and with the participation of the third separately localized holy force of the sacred Triyamazikamno, namely the holy force called reconciling, the blending of these two Exioiharis, arising in two distinct, independent, different beings, just gives, owing to the process called the process of the sacred El Muarno, which proceeds between those beings of opposite sex, the beginning for the arising of a new being. And the possibility in the given case of such an abnormal blending of two different kinds of Exioihari, then, occurred owing only to a certain cosmic law called the affinity of the number of the totality of vibrations, which proceeded owing to the second Transalpalnian perturbation to this ill-fated planet, and which then still continued to act for its own common presence. Concerning this cosmic law just mentioned, it is now absolutely necessary to tell you that it arose and began to exist in the universe after the fundamental sacred law of Triyamazikamno was changed by our Creator for the purpose of rendering the Heropas harmless, and after its previously totally independent holy parts had begun to be dependent upon forces coming from outside. You will understand this cosmic law also in all its aspects when, as I've already promised you, I shall explain to you in detail all the fundamental laws in general of world creation and world existence. Meanwhile, know, concerning this question, that in general, everywhere on normally existing planets of our great universe, the Exioihari, formed in the presence of a three-brained being who has perceptive and transformative organs for localizing the holy affirming part of the sacred Triyamazikamno, that is to say, a Keschapmartnian being of the male sex, can, owing to the just mentioned cosmic law, never be blended with the Exioihari formed in the presence of a Keschapmartnian two-brained being of the opposite sex. At the same time, the Exioihari formed in the three-brained Keschapmartnian being of the female sex can, sometimes, in those cases when a special combination of the blending of cosmic forces is obtained, and the mentioned law comes into effect, be completely blended under